Hi, I'm Robert Krog, a writer and editor from Memphis, Tennessee. I want to thank Sean Taylor again for the invitation to read for Indie Authors Read. Today I'll be reading to you my story, The Beauty of Being, which is in Tomato Slices, edited by Iscah. This is an anthology of tomato stories, poetry, art, and recipes. The Beauty of Being by Robert J. Krog. In the morning, the round, reddening tomato hung quivering on the vine as the wizard, his beard tucked into his belt to keep it out of the way, poured water over it from the glistening spout of his silver can. It quivered still as he spoke gentle words of encouragement to it. "There you go, so plump and nearly ripe. Such a good tomato. You keep growing and getting red and juicy for one more day, maybe two. Then you go into a soup, or maybe I'll just eat you like an apple." He reached down and caressed it, straightened, and went on through the garden, pouring water over every plant from his inexhaustible can. At the end of one row he stopped, noting damage to some of his squash. "Varmints!" he stated, deeply disgusted, and stomped into the cottage. Behind him in the garden, the ripening tomato trembled on the vine. Inside, he found his apprentice, dutifully studying a new spell. "I have to go into town today," he told the boy. "I won't be back until tomorrow afternoon." The boy looked up, trying to hide his elation. He said, "I'll take care of things while you're gone." The wizard merely grunted. "Really," the boy said, "I'll practice the new spell, and I'll sweep the floor, and I'll milk the goat and slop the pig. I'll clean up after dinner. I'll water the garden." "I've already watered the garden," said the wizard, "and the garden is what worries me most." "I'll water it in the morning, I promise. I won't slack off while you're away." "Bah!" said the wizard. "Your behavior is my least concern. You'll have pig's hooves at the end of your ankles for a week if I see fit. That is, if I don't just send you back home for good." The boy fell silent and waited for his master to say what was on his mind. The wizard looked out the window, fuming. "Varmints!" he muttered. The boy's ears perked up, but he held his tongue. When, after several minutes, his master had said nothing, he went back to his studies, poring over the spell to turn a spider web into a doily. "Stop what you're doing, boy," ordered the wizard at last. "I have another task for your meager skills." Unsure of what was coming, but too wary of his master's wrath at this point to be anything but obedient, he stopped and gave him his full attention. "I have a new spell for you to learn," stated the wizard. He stopped, then said, "No, there's no time for you to master a new spell, but I can put one in a wand and have you discharge it at the appropriate time. Come with me and I'll show you something new that you'll probably forget by tonight." The boy nettled on the inside, but obediently followed his master over to the wand chest in the corner of the cottage. The wizard drew out a battered old wand and proceeded to place a spell in it, slowly and carefully. The boy watched, interested in, but largely ignorant of, what the wizard was doing. When he was done, the wizard said, "You have but to point it at the dogwood tree on the edge of the garden at dusk, and order the tree to stop anything from eating the vegetables in the garden. The spell will last until dawn, when you arise, and then you can watch for varmints yourself. The spell will give the tree sentience, a reasonable amount of basic knowledge and mobility. Your thoughts and words will give it its mission and sense of purpose, so be clear in what you are thinking and feeling as well as what you are saying." He handed the wand to his apprentice. The boy took it eagerly and brandished it. "Don't gesture with it just yet, boy. It might go off." He stopped and set it down carefully. "So I'll say, 'You, tree, protect the garden from varmints that would eat the vegetables. Don't let anything eat the vegetables. Smite them and stomp them if they try.'" "Yes, well, that might work, but really try to be concise and clear. Now go back to your lessons." The wizard walked away, grumbling. "I don't know if I can keep that boy. He has no talent and doesn't apply himself." The boy heard him, but went back to his studies. Out in the garden, the tomatoes slowly reddened on the vine. Around noon, the boy hitched the donkey to the cart and brought it around to the front of the cottage. The wizard got in and drove away without a word. He'd already told the boy all he needed to know for that day. But the boy only waited until the cart was out of sight, down the dirt road, before running inside and finding the wizard's stash of licorices and other sweet treats. He was soon sitting on the porch, in the rocking chair, with his feet propped up, a handful of sweets he was sure the wizard would not miss on the table beside him, a cup of goat's milk beside that, and a novel in his hand. It wasn't often he had time alone, and one just couldn't study and practice every hour of the day. He tried to let the wizard's lack of faith in him roll off his back, but there it was, rankling deep in his mind as he licked the fingers of the hand that was not turning the pages. It was only an hour later that the sweets were gone, pace them though he tried. The novel took another several hours to finish, but by then he was thirsty. He went to the well and drew water, and then wondered, just wondered if he hadn't noticed a bottle of whiskey or two in the wizard's secret stash. He had. There was one full and one mostly empty. It was like fire when he sipped it, but he sipped it anyway. Strange thoughts and feelings came to his mind then, and he whiled away the fading sunlit hour, singing songs about lost loves and railing against how unfair the wizard was to him. "What's the use of it all?" he asked, when the first bottle was empty, casting his gaze to the ceiling above which his drunken mind shrewdly guessed there might be a sky, and in it some kind of divinity that knew the answer to his questions. "Why am I studying so hard if he doesn't appreciate it? What am I to do with myself if he sends me home? They won't want me there, that I can tell you. No, sir, they won't. I'd sooner have hooves and stay here than be there. Oh, what am I supposed to do?" He cast about for some better means of expressing himself, and tried a spell as proof of his competency. It did not work, and he stared long and hard at the goat in the yard, wondering why it had not turned into a radish. "Still," he said, standing up amid the clatter of his chair falling to the floor behind him, and throwing his gaze at the presumable sky somewhere beyond the ceiling, "I'm learning at my own pace and getting better. I bet I said 50% of the words for that spell, and that's 50%, which is half, which is pretty good for a beginner." He reached over and snatched up the wand that the wizard had left for him to employ at the dogwood at the edge of the garden. "This," he said, "this I cannot mess up. This I can do because it's child's play." He staggered to the door, looked out into the twilight, and shook the wand rather more than was required to get its attention, as only a simple flourish was called for. "You tree," he said, pointing at the part of the world in which stood the tree, "patrol and protect the garden from any varmints, just anything that tries to eat the vegetables, and do it just as best as you can because you expire at the dawn." He stood a moment, pointing. He vaguely wondered if he was doing it correctly. Nothing was happening. "Why me?" he moaned suddenly, after another moment of frantic pointing. "What's the meaning of it all?" He suddenly remembered that he had to give a flick of the wrist to discharge the spell, and slung the wand about from his elbow just for good measure. A green ball of magical power slung out in an arc. He turned and staggered back into the cottage. Behind him, the green ball of magical power fell onto a rock in the middle of the garden, sat a moment upon it, then dissolved and ran down the sides. A few drops slid down and touched the waiting skin of the red, ripening tomato. It quivered violently. It glowed with a green light. As the glow faded, the tomato and a part of the vine popped off the rest of the plant and landed neatly on the ground. It had enough vine about it to form the reasonable facsimile of arms and legs, and on one side of its globe something like eyes and a mouth appeared, though in the twilight they were hard to see. It looked around, surveyed the garden about it. After a moment's gauging the situation, it began to stalk purposefully through the garden. When it reached the edge of the cultivation, it turned right and began to march around the perimeter. Along the way it procured a splinter of wood from a stake, and held it as though it were a spear. "What are you?" asked a voice. The tomato turned, brandishing the splinter. "Who goes there?" it demanded to know. A tiny person leapt out of the grass beyond the garden, and landed with a flutter of wings on the dirt before the tomato, and bowed low to it, with a winsome smile on its little face. "I am Dotton," he said. "What are you doing here?" asked the tomato, the point of his splinter aimed at Dotton's chest. "I am asking you what you are," explained Dotton. "I am the garden guardian," declared the tomato. "What are you?" "I am a pixie." "I must ask you to go about your business," said the tomato. "I cannot allow any of these vegetables to be eaten." "I see," said the pixie, "that you have a job to do, and I will not hinder it. I do not want any of these vegetables. I prefer wild nuts, berries, and honey." "Oh," said the tomato. "Well, as I have a job to do, I must proceed on my patrol. Something might want to eat these vegetables, and I cannot allow that." "It sounds interesting to patrol with a tomato," said Dotton. "May I patrol with you?" The tomato thought this over, wrinkling up its tomato face as it thought. "I suppose that would be okay," it said at last. "Very good," said Dotton. Together they marched around the perimeter of the garden. Along the way, Dotton acquired a splinter of his own from a stake by the wall of the cottage, just under the kitchen window. When they reached the spot where they had met, Dotton asked, "What is your name?" The tomato thought about it and said, "I think my name is Tree." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tree." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Dotton." "Wonderful! It's a pleasureful night, just full of pleasureful things, I think." And they marched. The twilight deepened into night, and the glow of the moon increased. The marching grew rather tiresome to Dotton after the third time around. He stopped and sat on a stone. "Tree," he asked, "how long have you been here? I've never seen you before." "I've been here my whole life." "And how long has that been?" Tree thought this over. He had been pondering a great deal anyway, but had not been looking backward much. It was a new line of thought. "I popped off the plant over there," he waved a leaf in the right direction, "beside the big rock, and walked over there," he waved the same leaf, "and found my spear there," he gestured with the splinter, "and met you here." He looked pleasantly at Dotton. "Oh," said Dotton, "I see." It was dark. Tree added helpfully. "You're very young," said the pixie. "Young?" asked the tomato. "Not old," explained the pixie. "Right. I think I understand. I'm young, which means not old." "You're only as old as tonight. That's very young." A thought occurred to Tree. He voiced it uncertainly. "Dotton, how old are you?" Dotton had to think this over. "I'm about 6 summers." "6 summers," repeated the tomato. "Yep." "Is that old?" Dotton thought that over. It wasn't. It wasn't old at all. Everyone called him youngster, actually. "No," he said, "but it is a lot older than tonight." "Oh, I'm very young." "Yes, you are." "Dotton." "Yes?" "We should keep marching. I have to protect the garden." "Okay, we'll march some more," said the pixie with a sigh. They marched. Fireflies hovered in the air, blinking. Somewhere an owl hooted. Tree jumped and brandished his splinter. "It's just an owl. They eat bats and moths, not vegetables." "Oh, thank you." They marched in step. Dotton found that fun. "Dotton." "Yes?" "How many nights are in a summer?" Dotton scratched his head. I think it's about 1,000." You're very old, said Tree in awe. Everyone calls me youngster. Really? It's true. If you are young, what am I? He stopped marching and turned to Dotton, looking him full in the face. Dotton, puzzled, stared back, and then smiled broadly. You're brand new, he declared. A newborn baby. Wow, said Tree. Wow. They proceeded to march some more. What's it like, asked Tree, to be thousands of nights old? Dotton wrinkled up his face, thinking that one over, and replied, I don't know. I don't remember all of it. I see, murmured the tomato. They marched. The owl hooted again. A bat flew over their heads. Tree thought about his task, and about the night, and about the coming morning. He realized that he would not see the morning. That was clearly in his mind. He had a job to do, until morning, and he had to do it well, and it was all he had. Why me? He asked. Eh? Asked Dotton. What does it all mean? Asked the tomato. Dotton shrugged. They marched. Somewhere in the grassy patch across the road before the edge of the forest, a creature scurried. What is morning like? Asked Tree. The sun comes up, said Dotton. On the road, the creature, a rabbit, paused in the moonlight. The sun comes up, repeated Tree, as if he knew what that meant, but really he did not. After a moment he asked, What is the sun like? Dotton was pleased, because these were questions he could readily answer. He said, The sun is round and bright, like the moon, only brighter. It's so bright it hurts your eyes to look at it. It's hot, too, especially in the summertime. I see, said Tree. In the morning, said Dotton, it isn't dark like it is now. It's bright. Bright, Tree repeated. Bright. Like the moon, Dotton explained, only brighter. You can see things by its light more than by the light of the moon. Tree looked up at the moon. He looked at its sheen and the soft halo in the sky just around it. He looked at the slight illumination it gave and the shadows cast by its light. The moon, he said. The moon is beautiful. The rabbit crossed the road and made its way carefully over the lawn toward the garden. Yep, said Dotton. It's pretty. Is the sun even prettier? Dotton pondered that. No, he said. I like the sun, but I think the moon is prettier. You can't really look at the sun. It's too bright, but you can see more by it. I still wish I could get to see it, said Tree. You will, said the pixie, smiling. It will come up in the morning. Maybe we'll be able to play somewhere else then. No, said the tomato. I won't get to see the morning. Why not? Dotton didn't get an answer. With a snarl of defiance, the tomato raised its splinter spear and charged across the garden towards a large, shadowy, pointy-eared shape. Stunned, he watched as the shape, a rabbit he saw after a moment when it jumped high to avoid the tomato's charge, hopped away over the lawn into the tall grass, across the road. It took with it the splinter of wood, which the tomato had thrust into its left hind foot as it sprang away. Dashing for all it was worth, the little tomato made its way to the nearest stake and pried another splinter off of it. Dotton approached with his little mouth open in awe. You were very fierce and brave, he declared with great enthusiasm. I have a mission, said the tree, a job to do, and I only have tonight to do it, so I have to do it just as well as I can. Wow, said Dotton. But I wonder, said the tomato, leaning in and whispering, I wonder, why me? And what's it all mean? Oh, said the pixie, and I wish I could see the sun. The sun seems to me to be very important. Well, in the morning, began Dotton. No, I won't see the morning. I know that. I won't see it. I won't. I only have until then. What happens? Asked the pixie. I expire, he said, surely. What's that mean? I don't know, but I'm a little scared of it. Don't be scared, said the pixie, putting his hand on the leafy part that Tree used like a hand. I am a little, though, said Tree. But I do have my mission. It stood as tall as it could, and held its splinter spear high. Let's patrol some more, suggested Dawton. Maybe that rabbit will come back and we'll have some fun. Was that a rabbit? Asked Tree as they resumed their marching in step. I thought it was a varmint. What's a varmint? A thing that tries to eat the vegetables. I thought you were one at first. The pixie giggled. No. They marched around the garden several times, stoically sticking to their purpose, before Tree asked again, casting his gaze to the sky above in supplication. Seeing this, Dawton thought he knew what was on his friend's mind, and asked, What's what mean? The tomato stopped and scratched itself thoughtfully on top. I just have to ask it, it said. Maybe I mean, why am I doing this job instead of being a pixie like you? Why is your name Tree when you're clearly a tomato? Why do I only have tonight? Why do you talk when the other tomatoes don't? They don't. No, they don't. The pair walked on and passed the tomato plant from which he had sprung. There were other tomatoes upon it, but none of them were as close to ripe as Tree, and none of them showed any signs of animation or speech. They don't, said Tree, wondering. I never saw a tomato talk or walk before tonight, said Dawton. I wonder why not. Me too. Tree extended his leafy appendages towards the plant and asked again, Why me? What's it all mean? Rabbit! Shouted Dawton in an excess of excitement, pointing his splinter spear across the garden. Yah! Shouted Tree, dashing around the tomato plant and toward the offending creature, his splinter spear ready to thrust. Dawton took to the air and sped across with his splinter spear ready. The rabbit had been craving the cabbage all day, and had stayed hidden all day, waiting for its dinner time and avoiding a fox. When it had arrived after nightfall, it had been assaulted, most unexpectedly, and gone away with an unsatisfied craving and a splinter lodged in its paw. It had nothing to show for its day of patience, and would have to face the next day and the fox on an empty stomach if it did not succeed in finding food. It might have looked elsewhere, but it was craving the cabbage. It was feeling hungry and belligerent on its return. When the pixie and the tomato charged it, it fought. It leapt at them a little awkwardly for the remnants of the splinter in the one paw, but it leapt at them nevertheless, and it tumbled the tomato away from it with a shoulder block and nipped at the pixie with its large, shearing teeth. Dawton, fortunately, veered nimbly away, but poor Tree was all a tangle under the new blueberry bush. The rabbit knew well that tomatoes are edible too, and lunged to devour it. Pixies are nimble, though, and they are fast flyers. Dawton had turned around in a space smaller than a man's fist. He dove, splinter thrust ahead, at the rabbit and embedded it in a soft, fuzzy ear. The rabbit actually cried out in pain, altered its course, and hopped away from the garden again, its left hind foot throbbing, and its right ear bleeding. Whoopee! Cried Dawton, as he lit beside the tangle of tomato vine and blueberry shoots. We're dragon slayers! Really? Asked Tree, trying to extricate himself. What's a dragon? It's a great fire-breathing monster. Let me help you. Okay, so varmints are rabbits are dragons? Well, almost. Okay. They stepped away from the blueberry and resumed their marching. That was fun, said Dawton. I had been successful in my mission twice now, thanks to you. It's good. Glad to be of service, declared the pixie. They marched, full of a sense of accomplishment. At length, upon passing the tomato plant for the several time, Tree again stopped and looked up to the sky imploringly. Dawton, brandished the new splinter he had procured, and said, "We're heroes!" "And that's great," said the tomato, "but I still wonder, and I still long to see the sun, and I know I shall not, and I long to have thousands of summer nights, but I shall only have this one, and I must be satisfied with this mission and this night, but somehow I want more." Dotton thought a moment and asked, "Want to go play in the woods? That's always fun." "Really?" "Yes, really." They both made a step towards the woods, but Tree's other vine leg simply wouldn't budge. "I have to complete my mission," he said, sadly, and resumed his patrol. "Oh," said Dotton. "Well—" He stood for a moment, flightily imagining the joys of the woods, then sighed, then grinned, and rejoined Tree. "We'll do the forest tomorrow," he suggested. "You can, but I can't," said Tree. He wasn't accusing or jealous, but he was very sure of the facts of the matter. "Really?" "This night is all I have," he said. "You keep saying that." "It's the truth." They marched in silence. "Are they real?" Tree asked later. "Are what real?" "The things I want. The sun, more nights, reasons." "Sure, I've seen the sun and more nights. They're real for sure." "What about reasons?" asked the tomato urgently. Said the pixie. "Please, are they real?" He scratched his head. He scrunched up his face in the effort of thinking, and finally he shrugged his shoulders and said, "They must be real because you want them." The tomato considered that, and while he could find no flaw in it, he was not much comforted. He thought a moment and said, "I want real things." Dotton nodded and smiled helpfully. Feeling better, Tree smiled back at him. They resumed their marching. Across the road and over in the woods, the rabbit was dead. The wounds which had been inflicted upon it by the tomato and the pixie were hardly fatal, but they had slowed it down, especially the wound in its foot. The fox had come, drawn by the scent of its blood, and caught it at last, and was devouring it even then. It was a new creature, a new varmint, that was waddling unconcernedly by the fox, as it licked its chops over the grisly remains of the rabbit. It was an armadillo that was waddling out of the woods, and through the tall grass on the other side of the road, and across the road, toward the garden. The armored monstrosity was not interested in vegetables. It was an eater of ants, beetles, grubs, and spiders, and it was drawn by the scent of the newly tilled earth at one end of the garden, in which the wizard had recently planted several squash. It paused on the road, sniffing around to regain the scent it had lost in a momentary shift of the breeze. As they marched, Dotton thought that the little tomato looked so sad that he took one of his leafy appendages in his hand and said, "We're friends." In his scanty knowledge, the word friends was not present, so he asked, "What are friends?" "I like you," the pixie said, "and we play together and have fun. We're together, and it's good." "Oh," said the tomato, mulling that over. He thought he understood, and he repeated the words, "Friends, together, good." Together they marched on, hand in leaf. In the road the armadillo caught the scent again, and ambled on across the grass to the edge of the garden. Dotton and Tree saw it approaching. Dotton paused to say, "Wow!" but Tree charged ferociously at it, splinter spear at the ready. Dotton remembered himself and charged, too. The armadillo was not cognizant of the creatures coming its way. In its eagerness to dig for grubs and ants, it shuffled on, knocking the tomato aside without noticing. Tree tumbled on his vines and tangled up once again, this time in a squash plant. Dotton bravely dodged and thrust his splinter spear at the side of the armadillo, but did no damage. The splinter broke without piercing the monstrosity's armor. The armadillo, still unaware of his assailants, began digging into the ground, searching for grubs, in the process damaging the roots of a nearby squash. Dalton flew over it, avoided the clods of earth being flung behind it, and landed by Tree, helping him out of his tangle. "I say," said Tree, "it's not eating the vegetables." "What?" The tomato pointed at the armadillo. "It's not eating the vegetables, it's digging." "Oh, that's good, because I stabbed it in the side and my splinter broke without hurting it. I don't think it even knows we're here." "Well, I suppose we should continue our patrol." "Yeah, I guess," said Dalton. They marched on. Dalton acquired another splinter. Behind them, the armadillo uprooted the first squash completely in its quest for tasty things in the ground. "Do you suppose," asked Dalton as they approached the armadillo again and saw the devastation it was making in the patch of squash, "that it hurts the plants to have them out of the ground?" "I don't know," said Tree. I'm only supposed to stop things from eating the vegetables." "Oh," said Dalton. "Okay." They marched by the armadillo, giving it a wide berth as it continued to fling earth about. It noticed them, but paid them no heed. Its mouth was full of grubs. "I don't like it," declared Dalton. "Don't like what?" asked Tree. "That armadillo is tearing up the garden," declared the pixie, his tone outraged. It was true. It was very true. "Well, maybe we should ask it to stop." "It's an armadillo," explained the pixie. "It won't understand." "I see," said Tree. "We should stop it," declared Dalton. "Aren't we dragon slayers?" "You said we are." "Okay, let's stop it." "But I have a mission," protested Tree. "You won't have to leave the garden." "But—" "It'll be fun," said Dalton, and Tree lit up with excitement. "Okay," said the tomato. "Let's do it." "We need a plan," said Dalton. "Right," said Tree wisely. "What's that?" "We'll bash it with rocks, since splinters will break." Said the tomato, scratching its top thoughtfully. He picked up a pebble, the largest he could find at hand, and hefted it at the armadillo. The pebble bounced off. The armadillo went about its business of tearing up the soft ground and uprooting plants. "I don't think I can pick up a rock that is heavy enough," said Tree. "Maybe together," suggested the pixie. They looked around and found a very large pebble, at least 2 inches in diameter. Together, they carried it over close to the armadillo and threw it as hard as they could. It landed a bit short. Puffing, Dalton said, "I don't think this is going to work." "Well," said Tree, "at least it hasn't noticed us yet. I don't want it to breathe fire on us." "What?" asked Dalton. "You said that dragons breathe fire." "Oh," the pixie laughed. "I was exaggerating. This is just an armadillo. It's not really a dragon." "That's good," said the tomato. "I think fire would hurt." "Fire burns," agreed Dalton with sudden enthusiasm. "Right," said Tree. "Let's go get some." "Why?" "To fight the dragon." "Oh," said the confused tomato. So they ran until they reached the far end of the garden, and then Tree had to stop. "Where are you going?" he asked. Dalton stopped and looked around. "I don't know," he admitted. "Where will you find fire?" The pixie was perplexed. He cast about for a moment, his eyes searching, and then they settled on the window of the cottage, from which there came a slight glow from the fire set in the hearth there. "There!" he exclaimed, and rushed towards the house. Tree watched him fly away through the window, and then, conscious of his sense of duty, resumed his patrol for varmints. He walked by the monstrosity of the armadillo twice before the pixie flew out of the window of the house with some flaring thing in his possession. Then he lit on the ground before Tree. Dalton was bearing a stick, one end of which was a hot ember. He said, "Quick, let's make it bigger." "Okay," said Tree, and waited. Dalton looked at him urgently. Tree waited. "Quick, get twigs and things to burn," he explained, setting the stick down not far from the armadillo. "Okay," said Tree, and he gathered up what bits he could inside the garden. They piled twigs, dried grass, and leaves on the ember. Dawton fanned it with his wings, and soon the pile caught and blazed. Nearby, the armadillo paused in its digging and looked at the fire. It had by that point uprooted all but one of the newly planted squash. Dawton and Tree stood back, basking in the warmth, and pleased with the results. "Now what?" asked Tree. Dawton started and recalled the task at hand. "Now," he shouted, "we attack!" And he seized a burning twig and rushed at the armadillo with it. Amazed, it took Tree a moment to do the same. Dawton stopped before the creature, shouting and waving the burning twig. The monstrosity lunged at him, waddling forward so fast that he barely had time to dodge aside. Tree bravely stood his ground to protect the last squash, but it was already turning and chasing after its first target. Dawton took to the air to avoid its lumbering rush. Tree hurled his twig at it. The burning ember struck leathery hide and bounced off, unnoticed. Dawton began diving at its eyes, which did have an effect. The armadillo began turning every which way, trying to escape. Dawton, in his enthusiasm, shouted, "Come on, Tree, we have it confused! Now is the time to strike!" Tree went back to the fire and grabbed 2 burning twigs. He rushed into the squash patch, his vined legs almost spinning in his haste. "Be careful, Dawton," he called. The pixie laughed and continued diving at the armadillo's eyes. Tree whacked at its tail as it passed, but missed and was swept off his leafy feet by it instead. He rose to rejoin the fray, a burning twig in each leafy hand, but paused to think. The monstrosity was so much bigger than they, and its leathery armor was so impervious, that Dawton had the right idea. They needed to strike at vulnerable parts, vital parts. Too short to go after the eyes as Dawton was. He would have to go after its nose. He waited, watching as Dawton drove it this way and that, never quite getting its eyes, and never quite driving it out of the garden either. Indeed, the flighty pixie seemed to be having too much fun to think practically about the situation. But getting it out of the garden would be best, thought Tree. He waited. Dawton swooped, turned, and laughed as he waved his little torch in front of the monstrosity's eyes. Suddenly, when the great beast was facing Tree, its nose only inches away, he lunged and thrust both twigs into its snout. "Look out!" shouted Dawton, diving close in to strike again in its eyes. The beast shrieked and jumped straight up. Dawton collided with its leathery hide and bounced off. Stunned, he fell into the cabbages. The armadillo landed, snorted out the now extinguished but still hot twigs, and waddled off at an amazing pace, away from the garden. Tree stood up. Dawton was nowhere to be seen. He looked around, knowing he should resume his patrol, but wondering what had become of his friend. "Dawton?" There was no reply. He began to march again, calling out for the pixie and looking for a new weapon. He pried yet another splinter off a stake under the kitchen window, and followed the trail that their repeated marching had made around the perimeter of the garden. Above him, a bat flitted by with an owl chasing after it. Fireflies blinked under the stars, and the moon was getting close to the tops of the trees on the horizon. As he called out, he wondered what could have become of the pixie. He had been there just a moment before the end of the combat. He had even called a warning. Could the armadillo have eaten him when it jumped so high in the air? Was its belly finally full, and that was why it had left? He stopped in his tracks, stunned by the thought. "Oh, Dawton," he said, "you were such a good friend, and I liked you, and now you're gone." He sighed and marched on. He had, after all, to do his duty, regardless of how he felt. He stopped by the tomato plant, from whence he had sprung, and asked the sky again, "Why me? What is the meaning of it all?" A groan came just after the question, but it did not come from him, or, he realized after a startled moment, from the tomato plant either. It came from a cabbage, a quarter of the way around the big rock. He brandished his spear fiercely and investigated, wondering what might be over there eating the cabbage. It was Dawton, of course, and beside him, his now extinguished little torch. "Oh, friend," said Tree, "what is the matter?" Dawton made no response. "What do I do now?" asked the tomato. A moth fluttered by. He shook Dawton by one shoulder. The pixie moaned, but did not awaken. Unwilling to abandon his friend, and unable to abandon his duty to guard the garden, he stood a moment in indecision. Then, impelled by the duty, he resumed his patrol. He cast frequent glances back at the cabbage, and when the cabbage was hidden by the other plants, at the rock above it. An idea occurred to him. When he returned to the spot where Dawton was, he gently lifted the pixie and climbed on top of the rock. As he had suspected, he could see the whole garden from the top. It was a good guard post. He set Dawton down gently and held his hand while scanning the garden for signs of varmints. He stayed thus as the stars slowly wheeled by and the moon sank beneath the trees. No more varmints seemed interested in the vegetables, but he stayed vigilant. Later, when the moon was just a vague glow behind the trees, Dawton awoke, rubbed his aching head, and looked up at the tomato in wonder. "I say, tree, there you are, and here I am, and I wonder how we got here." Tree looked at him and smiled as much as his ill-defined features allowed. "I found you in that cabbage," he explained, "and put you up here so I could watch you and the garden at the same time. I was afraid I had lost you before I found you, and so I didn't want to go away from you." "Oh," said Dawton, "well, that seems fine to me." He sat up next to his friend. "I can see the whole garden from here," said Tree.
"Yes," yawned the pixie, "but you can see it better from up there."
He pointed up at the windowsill. "I suppose I could, but how would I get there?" "I could fly you up there." It seemed a fine idea. He assented. "Let us do that!" And the pixie took a hold of his leafy hands and lifted him up with much whirring and straining of wings to the windowsill. "I can see it all better from up here," said Tree, looking the garden over. He looked down the sheer wall and asked in sudden worry, "You will fly me down if a varmint tries to eat the vegetables, won't you?" "Naturally," said his friend. So they sat on the windowsill together, enjoying the breeze, which was nicer up a little higher as they were. "What is that?" asked Tree. There's my finger too big. "What is that?" asked Tree, pointing east. "What's what?" "It isn't so dark over there anymore." "Oh!" laughed the pixie. "The dawn is nearly here." "Then the night is almost over?" "Yep, we'll be able to play in the woods after you expire." "I don't think so," said the tomato, "and I'm afraid." His leafy appendages trembled. He stood up, looking east, eager for the light, hungry for the light, but terribly afraid. He glanced at the garden. It was no further disturbed. He looked at the pale, beautiful, dreadful light in the east. He squeezed Dawton's hand, and the pixie cried out, snatching his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm very sorry." Dawton looked at him curiously, worriedly, then said, "It will be well if you just hold my hand without squeezing it so." He stuck out his hand again, and Tree took it more gently, and though he held it tightly, did not squeeze it painfully again. "It will all be good in the end," said the pixie. "You'll see." He didn't know why he said it. Other than that, he wanted to reassure his new friend. "There isn't anything to be afraid of." "I wish I knew what it meant to expire," said the tree, "and why this night is all I have." "How do you know that?" "I just know it. I don't know how." They looked east in silence for a time. After a bit, Dawton softly whistled a tune he knew to stave off boredom. Tree, trembling less for the comfort of his friend's touch brought him, looked eagerly and fearfully at the growing light, yearning for its source. "Is it truly true?" he asked at last. "Is what truly true?" asked Dawton. "Are all those things I wish for real? The sun, and more nights, and reasons?" "Of course they are." "They are all real." "I think so." "The sun and more nights are not for me, Dawton," he said, looking earnestly at his friend. "Truly?" Truly, but reasons might be for me. Tell me that they are real, and that I'll find them. Reasons are real, and you will find them. Thank you. The sun peeked over the horizon a moment later. Tree gasped in awe, and the tomato sagged down to the windowsill, the leaf slipping out of the pixie's hand. Dawton looked closely and sadly at his friend. Tree? There was no response. Tree? He asked again, poking the tomato gently. He looked closely in the new light and saw that what had passed for facial features had disappeared. He stood straight, sighed, and said, Maybe he'll be back tomorrow night, and flew away in a whir of wings, a little less cheerful for a time, and forever more thoughtful than he had been before that night. Behind him on the windowsill, the tomato ripened under the warming influences of the morning sun. Around an hour after sunrise, the apprentice awoke with a bad hangover and stumbled out to the well to drink a lot of water, after which he went in to find some food that would not offend his surprisingly delicate stomach. He did not then notice the state of the squash patch in the garden. He ate, he cleaned, he opened his books up to where he had been the day before and plunged desperately into his studies, knowing full well that he had squandered the day before, as far as his studies were concerned. When he went to the well for water again near noon, he noticed at last the state of the squash patch. It was then that he wept. After he'd had a cleansing but otherwise useless cry, he began replanting the squash as best he could, and watering them with a silver can that never ran out. Then, truly desperate, he went in to see if he could find a spell to rejuvenate plants. It was thus that the wizard found him a couple of hours later, poring over his books and praying that his master had not noticed the state of the garden. Well, boy, put the donkey cart away, was all that his master said. He obeyed with alacrity. The wizard, stiff and aching from his long cart ride, entered the kitchen, sat down by the window, and noticed the tomato. Oh my, he said, absently seeing, at the same time, the evidence of his apprentice's desperate efforts in the squash patch, and wondering whether he should dismiss the boy or give him hooves or another chance. This is a tasty-looking tomato. He picked it up, plucked it from the bit of vine still attached to it, brushed it off, and took a bite. Juices ran down his chin. He wiped it with his handkerchief, and then he sighed. He'd worry about the boy after a snack and a rest. Oh, he said, now that's a tomato. The end. And that was The Beauty of Being, as found in Tomato Slices from Amoeba Ink, edited by Iscah, an anthology of tomato stories, poetry, art, and recipes. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time and patience.